A lot more to that story, and it's important that you look at the rest of the story before coming to conclusions. It's obvious what the media wants you to take from the story. Let's look at some of the headlines that the media has used when reporting on this story. The Washington Post headline says, 7-year-old migrant girl taken into Border Patrol custody dies of dehydration, exhaustion. The AP is even worse. It says, 7-year-old immigrant girl dies after Border Patrol arrest. NPR's headline is, 7-year-old migrant girl dies of dehydration and shock in U.S. Border Patrol custody. Now, clearly, from the way these headlines are worded, you are meant to conclude that the child died because of something awful that happened to her while she was in custody. That obviously is what you're meant to take from that, right? You're meant to immediately place the blame on Border Patrol. Yet, if you look at the full story, you see that this is an obvious misdirection and misrepresentation, and a really disgusting and just awful one as well. In reality, as it turns out, it is true that she died in the custody of Border Patrol. But to phrase it that way is clearly misleading, because she died only 8 hours after being taken into custody, and she died of dehydration and shock, which is not something that happens to a person in the span of 8 hours. You cannot dehydrate someone to the point of death in the span of 8 hours. But you have to read 4 paragraphs down into the AP story to learn that she hadn't eaten or had anything to drink in several days as she was making the trek across Mexico with her father. That is how she got to the point of fatal dehydration and exhaustion, is because she had not eaten or had anything to drink in days. The AP, of course, tries to pivot this right back to the Border Patrol. So the article says the girl's death raises questions about whether whether border agents knew she was ill and whether she was fed anything or given anything to drink during the 8+ hours she was in custody. But wait a second, doesn't it more so raise questions about why she wasn't given anything to eat or drink for days leading up to this? Isn't that really the question? If a child dies of dehydration, do you ask, well, what has she been doing for the last 8 hours? Or do you ask, what's been going on with this child for the last 3, 4, 5 days? I don't know anything about her father. It says that she came across the border with her father. I don't know anything about her father. I don't know anything about the situation other than what's being reported. And what's being reported is that she hadn't had anything to drink or to eat in several days. So a decision was made, apparently, to make this journey from Guatemala without proper provisions. A decision was made, apparently, to continue along, keep going, even though the girl obviously was not being provided with the basic necessities that she needs to live. This was not a decision that the U.S. government made. By the way, here's another question. Was the father starving and dehydrated? I don't know the answer to that question. I didn't see it mentioned anywhere. But if he also went days without drinking water, he also should have been on death's door. Obviously, a 7-year-old child is going to be more susceptible and more frail than a grown man. But even a grown man, if you don't drink for 3, 4 days when you're hiking, when you're on this perilous journey, you're going to also be very sick and probably needing hospitalization. It doesn't say anything about that. If he himself was not dangerously dehydrated, if he did drink, then you really have to wonder why his daughter had nothing to drink while he cared for himself. But we don't know. These are just questions that should be asked. And they should be asked about the father. Okay, not about Border Patrol. It's of course being implied by some on the left that Border Patrol must not have given her any water or done anything to treat her while she was in their custody, but there's no basis for that assumption whatsoever. Obviously, they should have given her water. We have no reason to think that they didn't. In fact, when she began having seizures, she was airlifted to a hospital where unfortunately she died anyway. But the point is, if this was pure neglect, if this was how the left is trying to paint it, obviously will paint it, of the Border Patrol, they just don't care about the livelihood of these people, they're just leaving them to die. Well, if that was the case, why was she airlifted, which is obviously an extreme measure? That's something that you do when you're trying desperately to save someone's life. So why was she airlifted to the hospital if she was being neglected? It would seem because they sought out medical